When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
With the Venmo debit card, you can Venmo everything. Your favorite band's merch? You can Venmo this. Or their next show? You can Venmo that. Visit venmo.me/debit to learn more. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. pursuant to license by MasterCard International Incorporated. The card may be used everywhere MasterCard is accepted. Venmo purchase restrictions apply.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. We have made it through the Madison presidency. I'll be honest, there were some times that I was beginning to wonder if I was ever going to leave the Madison presidency. Not to say that it was a bad experience. I learned so much in the course of the series. I learned so much about Madison, about the time, about some of the key players. It was a great experience. It just felt like we were never going to get past it, but we did. This episode was originally intended to be more of a conversation with my vice presidency's co-host, Alex. Unfortunately, we are dealing with some family situations on his side of the family, so we weren't able to do that. I'm hoping to be able to do that with Q&A episodes moving forward, but we weren't able to make it happen this time. So sorry about that. That's part of the reason why this episode has been delayed. So you'll just be stuck with me for this episode. So the first episode of the Madison series was launched on February 6th, 2022. So much has happened since then. We had 47 episodes total, 2,094 minutes of audio. I consulted 325 sources. I wrote, in terms of the scripts, 874 pages with 286,629 words. That, my friends, is a lot. And you were there for this journey, and I cannot thank you so much. I want to begin this episode by thanking you, because I could not have done it without you. I could not have done it without the support and encouragement of listeners. And I especially want to thank our patrons. I could not do this without you, without your support. So thanks so much to Matthew, Michelle, Jeremy, Ike, Joshua, Terrell, Howard, Michael, Eric, James, Scott, Michelle, Allison, Alicia, John, Elizabeth, and Andrew. Their generosity on a monthly basis helps me to be able to have the resources that I need in order to keep doing this podcast. So I cannot thank them enough. If you'd like to join them in helping to support the Presidency's podcast on a regular basis for as little as $1 a month, please go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up. This gets you access to an ad-free feed, and at the various levels, there are different perks that allow me to be able to just thank you for supporting this podcast. If you're not able to commit to a monthly contribution, there are many other ways that you can help support. I do have a wish list for books that I would really like to bring on for research. As you can see, with 325 sources, this is a heavily researched podcast, and I need access to whatever resources I can get. And so I'm regularly updating that with new sources that come about that come my way. And so if you're interested in that, there is that available. You can go to the website at presidenciespodcast.com. There is a section of the website that is all about how you can support the podcast. If nothing else, if you haven't already, I hope that you'll take time to leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcast. If it has that capability, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, Spotify, there are many places that you can do that. You can also do that at the website, presidenciespodcast.com. So I hope you'll consider that, because it really does mean a lot to get the word out there about why other folks should be listening to Presidencies. And for all of you who have supported in whatever way that you've shared information about the podcast with other folks, I cannot thank you enough. This podcast is continuing to grow. We are in our 9th year, and we're still going. We're still going. So work has begun on the Monroe series. So I'm hoping to get to that sometime in the fall. It has been a challenging year here at Presidencies Podcast. We've had some things that have come up that have been unexpected, and we're working our way through it. And thank you to all of you who have reached out and given your support. I greatly appreciate it. The podcast continues on. We've got some more episodes coming. We've got interviews. We've got seat at the table. We've got some more vice presidencies. We've got a lot coming up, and we will be getting to the Monroe series, like I said. But before that, I wanted to wrap up the Madison series, how we have previous series, by answering some of your questions. Of course, with 47 episodes, I've tried to be as extensive as possible, but I know that there are still things that may be lingering that you may just want to know a little more about. And so we did have a few listeners send in their questions, so I did want to address those. First of all, we had 2 questions that were pretty similar, so I wanted to address both of them. So Andy asked, given the anti-British, pro-French stance of the Democratic Republicans, do you think the War of 1812 was inevitable? The parallel that I keep thinking about is the Iraq War. As soon as they took office, it seemed like an inevitability that Bush and Cheney would pursue a war with Iraq. Don asked, like I said, a similar question. Having studied Madison and the War of 1812, do you think the war could have still been avoided in 1812, or was it inevitable long before the declaration of war? So basically, both of these questions are about, was the War of 1812 inevitable? My answer? While I wouldn't say that it was inevitable, I do think that there were some key factors working against any attempts to avoid the conflict. And indeed, we see if we rewind a few years back to 1807 provides an example of how the conflict was not inevitable. So if you'll recall from the Jefferson series, the Chesapeake Leopard affair happened off the coast of Virginia. And this was where the British boarded a U.S. naval vessel, the USS Chesapeake, and took 4 people they accused of being deserters from the British Royal Navy. Now, this was a clear violation of American sovereignty, and there was political will both from the public and political leaders for war. So it was a time of great animosity, great turmoil. Folks were really riled up. They wanted to go to war. President Jefferson, however, realized that the nation was not ready for war, nor was he inclined to turn to that remedy to the issues that the U.S. had with Great Britain. Even though he wasn't a fan of Britain, he was not a war hawk. Thus, while expressing public indignation and trying to, go ahead and say, yeah, I feel your pain, I understand, Jefferson was measured with his words and worked behind the scenes to keep things from escalating out of his control. Indeed, as you know from the Jefferson series, we did not go to war. Now, we did have the Embargo Act, which some folks may argue war may have been a bit better than the Embargo Act, but Jefferson was able to avoid war at that time. Unfortunately, James Madison was not Thomas Jefferson, and too many situations needed his attention during his first term for him to effectively steer the nation away from war. In particular, he was still coping with the after effects of that failed embargo policy. Madison was also facing a more belligerent counterpart on the other side of the Atlantic in the form of British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval. Now, if the Earl of Liverpool had come to power sooner, and indeed we saw in the lead up to the War of 1812, war was declared, but around that same time, Liverpool had come in and they were trying to avoid war. They went ahead and repealed the orders in council that were one of the big sticking points of dispute. So Liverpool was ready for peace. And if he had come in sooner, then I think there is a possibility that the U.S. and Britain may have come to a diplomatic agreement to walk back from the brink. So, short answer, no, I don't think it was inevitable. I think that there was a lot that made it possible and that made it the more likely scenario. But I think that there may have been ways to avoid it, but just who was in charge at which time and what authority they had, what political clout, I think that's what determined why the U.S. ended up declaring war, why war with Britain happened in 1812.
Hey guys, it's CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. I'm partnering with Abercrombie this season to tell you all about their viral denim. All you need to know is denim should fit like this. My jeans need to check a lot of boxes. Fit first, trend second. They need to go with whatever I'm feeling. And Abercrombie Denim has it down, whether I'm throwing on a tee or putting a whole fit together. Shop Abercrombie Denim in the app, online, and in store.
Our next question comes from Matthew and is as follows. Did James Madison share Jefferson's skepticism of the powers of the federal judiciary, and how did this impact his appointments to the Supreme Court? So, in addition to going back through some of my notes in order to answer this question, I also consulted with a white paper by John Rakoff entitled James Madison and the Judicial Power, which I'll have linked on the sources section of this episode. So, Rakoff goes through Madison's career and the evolution of his thoughts on the judiciary. As he found in his research, prior to the Constitutional Convention, the judiciary just was not a big priority in terms of Madison's thinking. As Rakoff notes, quote, he, i.e. Madison, was not even sure whether there should be a separate national judiciary and thought that a system might be worked out where state judges could, quote, swear fidelity to the general constitution to rule on cases involving, quote, foreigners or inhabitants of other states. Now, as we know, of course, the Virginia Plan, which was ultimately proposed and was drafted by James Madison, created the federal judiciary as a separate branch of government. However, even at this point in his thinking, Madison had something more proactive in mind. He thought that the federal judiciary should examine legislation as soon as it was enacted by the government and judge its constitutionality then, rather than waiting for a case to come up involving the legislation. Now, as we know, this did not play out. But, and if you're sitting there thinking, wow, that's rather wild, there actually was an example of this in the time. So it's not as far-fetched as we in the 21st century may think it. New York had what was called a Council of Revision that Madison drew as an example, which consisted of the governor, the chancellor, and, you guessed it, the state Supreme Court justices, which would examine legislation after it was passed by the state assembly and either revise it or veto it. Now, the one part of this scheme that Madison had in mind that did play out in the system that came through in the U.S. Constitution was that the 2/3 majority of Congress could override a veto, but this was just the executive ruling on legislation, the president, without any role for the judiciary. Now, with the system that was ultimately enacted, and specifically regarding the idea of judicial review, considering that Madison had initially envisioned a more active judicial review role, he accepted the concept in principle. But as Rakoff notes, quote, his, i.e. Madison's, analysis questioned whether the judiciary should be the final voice on the constitutional validity of statutes. Now, while Madison had some concerns about whether the Supreme Court would go full on with Hamilton's loose interpretation of the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, By and large, it doesn't seem that he was quite as concerned about the federal judiciary overreaching as Jefferson was, and he certainly lost no sleep over John Marshall being Chief Justice. As we discussed in the Madison presidency series, despite his being in office for 2 full terms, Madison only had 2 seats come open while he was president. Now, while he did try to nominate folks who he felt might shift the ideological leaning of the court to the Democratic-Republican viewpoint, Madison's main problem was finding either a candidate who would accept the post or one that Congress would approve. He was also hampered by the fact that the seats were seen as belonging to a certain geographic region. So when a vacancy occurred, he had to find someone from the same region to replace them with. And so that already narrowed the pool of candidates that he had from which to choose. So with this in mind, let's go through trying to fill these 2 vacancies, and you'll kind of see how this didn't work out quite as Madison might have hoped, but we may be able to get a little better idea of his thinking in this. So when William Cushing of Massachusetts passed away in 1810, and I should note here that Cushing was one of George Washington's original nominees in 1789. So he had been on the court for quite a while by this point, 1810. So with that seat becoming vacant, Madison looked to the man who had served as Jefferson's first Attorney General, Levi Lincoln of Massachusetts. This was a solid ideological choice. It didn't take Madison long to think up Lincoln. The only problem was, Lincoln, though the Senate did confirm him, so Madison sent in Lincoln's name to the Senate. They confirmed him. He wrote to Lincoln, "Hey, great news." Lincoln wrote him back that he wasn't interested, as he felt that he was too old and that someone younger should be nominated, so they weren't just sending in another nomination in another year or so. He's like, why are you going to go through this again in a couple of years? I don't have too much time left, which he lived to 1820, by the way, another 10 years. But he was like, just go ahead and pick somebody younger. All right, back to the drawing board. Now, this is where this idea of a limited pool from which to choose was really hampering what Madison could do in terms of changing the ideological course of the court, because there weren't many Democratic Republicans in New England. At this point, Federalists still dominated the region. And so Madison started asking around. He started asking trusted advisors with New England ties, who else is there? Lincoln would have been great. Let's figure out somebody else. And he was sent the name Alexander Walcott of Connecticut. Now, while Walcott had not been a judge yet to that point, he was a lawyer, and it wasn't necessarily seen that someone had to have been a judge previously to get a Supreme Court appointment. So this was still a time where, somebody may not have been a judge a day in their life and ends up getting nominated to the Supreme Court. However, the Senate thought that Walcott was woefully unqualified and a mediocre talent. So they rejected his nomination. All right, so who else was there? Well, there was this guy who was quite well known. He had spent time in Washington. He was a skilled diplomat. That's right, our old friend John Quincy Adams, who was, of course, at this point aligned with the Democratic-Republican Party. He had shifted from being a Federalist to a Democratic-Republican under Jefferson. He was seen as somebody who, was skilled. He would be this great mind on the court. So Madison sent in John Quincy Adams's name, and the Senate was all for this nomination. They knew him. They were like, okay, this guy is good. The problem here, however, was that Adams was in St. Petersburg serving as U.S. Minister to Russia. And as Madison hadn't consulted with him before he was confirmed, it took a while for the news to get to Adams. When it did, he wasn't pleased. He didn't want to be relegated to the Supreme Court, which despite John Marshall's efforts to increase its stature, was still not seen as quite a prestigious of an appointment as future generations would view it. It was still not really, you didn't aim to be on the Supreme Court. Again, it would take time for Adams's declination to make its way back to D.C., and by this point, when Madison got that JQA was saying thanks but no thanks, the seat had been vacant for nearly a year. So he's growing pretty desperate. He's like, okay, we need to end this. This is getting farcical. So another name was brought to Madison's attention, Joseph Story of Massachusetts. Now, it should be noted that Jefferson, yes, Jefferson, had tried to warn Madison off of Story, saying that he was a quote-unquote pseudo-Republican. But at this point, and again, the seat has been vacant for a year now, Madison was looking for any Democrat-Republican with a pulse from New England to fill that vacancy. So, Story was in, name was sent, he was confirmed by the Senate. Yay! And he actually agreed to it. But here's where things went wrong for Madison in terms of shifting the ideology of the court. Not only would Story become John Marshall's right-hand man in the Supreme Court, the Federalist John Marshall, but he would serve on the court until 1845. Yes, he was a pseudo-Republican. He agreed more ideologically with John Marshall. And so here is another basically Federalist on the Supreme Court. Whoops. But Madison had another chance. So his other nominee, Gabriel Duval of Maryland, was put forward after Samuel Chase of Maryland, who was the guy who Jefferson had tried to have removed from the Supreme Court during his tenure. So Chase passed away in 1811. So took a little bit, but he's finally off the court. Okay, now let's find a trusted Democrat Republican. Let's find somebody who we can really trust here. Duval, at the time of his nomination, had served since 1802 as Comptroller of the Treasury under Albert Gallatin and was one of Gallatin's trusted lieutenants. And again, this is a time D.C. was a small town, so naturally Madison had probably encountered him, and he's got Gallatin's blessing. He is a solid Democratic Republican. He's somebody that we can trust. So his name was sent in, confirmed, no problems there. However, when Duval's legacy is discussed by legal scholars and historians, Duval is one of the folks frequently brought up as a candidate for the title of the most insignificant justice of all time, despite the fact that he served on the court for over 2 decades. So he may have had strong Democratic-Republican principles, but he just didn't have influence on the court. He was not somebody who shifted the court from John Marshall's influence, and it would take quite a while for that to happen. So Madison failed to shift the ideological makeup of the court. But it seems that he did at least try, but he wasn't quite as concerned about it as Jefferson. He had other things on his mind. He had other plans. He had other things that were more of a priority for him. So I hope that explanation helps to better understand kind of where Madison was and, how that kind of went into his picks for the court, but unfortunately just situations did not work out to really make much of an impact. So thank you so much for that question. Don asked, which vice president was Madison closest to? Clinton or Gary or neither of them? So this one, definitely Gary. And for those of you who haven't listened to the Vice Presidency series, we did cover both George Clinton and Elbridge Gerry. So I highly encourage you, go and check those out. Both are very fascinating figures in American history, widely different men. Now, as Gary's biographer, George Athan Bilius, noted, during his tenure as VP, Gary was very involved in Democratic Republican social life in Washington. And as we know, Dolly Madison was at the center of it. This meant lots of dinners and events at the president's mansion. Though it's harder to gauge the impact of social interactions to the politics of the time than vote counts and the back and forth of debates, Gary was very much aligned with the administration, and it is likely that he coordinated with executive department officials as well as key pro-administration congressional leaders on key pieces of legislation. Clinton, meanwhile, had been reluctant to serve another term as vice president, and his supporters had even put him forward as a challenger to James Madison in the lead up to the 1808 election. Now, while Clinton didn't reject the nomination to a second term, which was a scheme by Madison supporters to try and, knock Clinton out of the running to keep him from, doing a more independent run against James Madison. They're like, well, let's just put him on the ticket again. He's already vice president. He'll be stuck there. While Clinton didn't publicly accept it, he didn't do anything to help with the campaign effort, but he also did not reject the nomination for the vice presidency for a second time. And as we know, he was reelected and he became Madison's vice president just as he had been Jefferson's. But during his second term, Clinton at times actively worked against the Madison administration. The most prominent example of this being his tie-breaking vote against the recharter of the National Bank that was being pushed by Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. Clinton also did not go out of his way to garner any administration support, opting against participating in the social court of Washington and instead spending evenings at his rented rooms when he had to be in the nation's capital. Now, it's likely that he would have been replaced on the ticket even if he hadn't died before the congressional caucus, and opposition to the administration was rallying behind his nephew, DeWitt Clinton, to challenge Madison in his re-election bid. So, as I said, these are two very different men. Clinton was ambitious. He was really not aligned with Madison versus Gary, who was aligned with Madison. He, as we saw in his vice presidency's episode, at this point, he had been turned out of office as governor of Massachusetts. He was looking for something else. And so the Madison administration, by putting him on the ticket, gave him an opportunity. So he had reasons to support the administration. But of course, he passed away. He didn't serve out the remainder of his term. And so he wasn't able to have as much influence as he may have if he had continued on for his full term. But he was definitely much more in sync with Madison than George Clinton was. So thank you so much for that question. Thanks to all of you who submitted questions for this. I always love to hear your questions, to hear your thoughts on episodes, to hear how we're going with this series. And with that, it's time to close the book on the Madison presidency series. I am hard at work right now on the research for the Monroe presidency series. I already have scripts started on the first couple of episodes. I'm so excited about where this is going. It's going to take me a little time to get those up and running, but I assure you I'm working diligently behind the scenes. And in the meantime, we've got Seat at the Table episodes. We've got Vice Presidency's episodes to come out. We've got interviews coming out. There's going to be so much content out there for you. So no worries there. You are going to have your regular presidency's fix. And then we will get started with the Monroe series. But again, as we wrap up, I just cannot thank all of you enough for listening, for all of your support, for all of your encouragement. It's been an amazing journey thus far, and I'm looking forward to where we're going. We are constantly growing in terms of listenership. We are constantly growing in terms of followers on social media. I've got ideas of how I want to take things to another level, new opportunities to be able to share more with you, and I hope you're as excited about where we're going as I am. So with that said, I'm going to wrap up because I need to get to reading and researching so that I can get some more episodes out to you. But in the meantime, if you haven't already visited the website, presidenciespodcast.com, if you're still getting caught up on episodes, all the episodes are there, including source notes for the episodes. I have a section of the website that has links to more information about all the American presidents. I have information on how you can help support the podcast. There's so much there. So check out the website if you haven't already, presidenciespodcast.com. If you don't follow me on social media already, you can find me on all the major platforms. I'm on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. I do have a YouTube channel, so search for Presidencies and you will find it. If you have any questions or comments that you want to share with me through email me at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. I always love to hear from listeners, like I said, so please feel free to reach out. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.